This is Professor Lynn Porter of Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on Romantic and late neoclassical architecture and decor. And I'm going to focus in on the English Regency and Greek Revival. These are all the things I'm going to talk about in this lecture: when we are and what's going on in the world, the basic concepts and how those concepts are expressed in the designs themselves. We're going to look at the major artists, John Nash and Thomas Hope and George Smith. And then for Regency, we're going to look at both Cumberland Terrace and the Royal Pavilion. And for the Greek Revival, we're going to look at the Ashmolean Museum. We're also going to look at some interior design, some furniture, and we're going to finish up by looking at a throne room. So the term romantic is a rather mushy term, so I want to point out that in France, in about this period, you're looking at the Directoire and the French Empire in the late 17s, early 1800s. In England, you have the Regency style and the Greek Revival at about the same period of time. And in America, you have a Greek Revival and the American Empire look. So those tend to splash over onto each other. In this lecture, I'm going to focus in on the Regency and Greek Revival in England. In terms of what's going on during this period, we've got a very, very active time. Starting at the top, we have Thomas Jefferson being elected as the third president in the United States. Jane Austen is publishing her first novel, Sense and Sensibility. Further down, Baltimore adopts the gas street lighting. And we have the first steam railways in Britain, and in a parallel way, the railways in the United States get started, first in South Carolina. And the end of this period is when Queen Victoria takes the throne in England. And in this period in England, we have a lot going on. England is getting used to the fact that America is no longer British. That means they're looking to Africa and India to increase their trade and commerce and money. The victories over Napoleon create these strong nationalistic feelings of patriotism. George, the Prince Regent, sees himself as the bee's knees. He is the arbiter of everything fanciful. And of course, he's hugely unpopular because he is spending a tremendous amount of money and living a rather hedonistic lifestyle. Of course, we're talking about impacts from the Industrial Revolution that began in the textile industry and produced lots of new materials, made existing materials much more available and cheaper. So it boosted economic prosperity, increased a tremendous amount of coal use, which had its very negative effect, and a huge burst of urbanization where everyone moved into the cities for those factory jobs. And this means that people were living longer and marrying younger and having larger families. It means the rich people get rich. It means the middle class gets richer. And then there is this middle class demand for fancy things where we have less formal living patterns. And fashion surpasses taste. It's interesting here. So the fashions change quickly, not always in a tasteful way, but we have a tremendous burst of stylistic choices. When we look at the concept of romanticism, we're talking about a time when people's emotions tended to be the driving force. So everyone's feelings were supreme. This is when you start to get Beethoven writing his incredibly emotional music. And so you also have this looking to nature as the perfect thing in the world. So we have nature, we have antiquity, we're going to combine all of that together, but in a way that we're seeking the beautiful and the sublime, or we are experiencing nature in a way that is awe-inspiring or even terrifying. The Romantics value the styles of the past because of their symbolic associations and also their ability to evoke an emotional response. So classicism tends to dominate everything, but there's a tremendous variety. You have classical influences from Greek and Roman, Egyptian, and the Italian Renaissance. And up to this time, we haven't had a lot of Greek influence. But we also see influences from many non-classical sources, from the English Norman style, which is a medieval style, from the Gothic style, even into the Tudor and Elizabethan styles, and a tremendous interest in what was considered exotic. So Chinese styles or Turkish styles or South Asian Indian. So the overall forms of structures tend to stay the same, but when you look at the decoration of the form, that's where you can see the inspiration for the design. As for the specific design characteristics, you see some designers trying very hard to be correct based on the archaeological record of the time, and you see other designers who are much more eclectic. They take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and mix it up together. And it's these eclectic designers that tend to go more for asymmetrical forms and irregular forms. But in general, the style tends to be symmetrical, tends to have attention to proportion, but also tends toward that monumental scale, using these antique forms and details in the surface treatment. The major artists of this period in England are John Nash. He built quite a few things for the Prince Regent. Thomas Hope, who very much preferred the purity of the classical forms. And George Smith was also a big influencer because he wrote his collection of designs for household furniture. So you see how these people are starting to not only build and design structures and furniture, but they're also publishing books designed to influence the people in the middle class. So these are the three buildings we're going to look at in detail. For an example of the Regency style with a classical inspiration, we're going to look at Cumberland Terrace. For the Regency style with an exotic inspiration, we're going to look at the Royal Pavilion. And then for an example of the English Greek Revival style, we're going to look at the Ashmolean Museum. So let's take a look at Cumberland Terrace. The placement of this building is important because here we have a ground plan view of Regent's Park, and Prince George was planning to build a palace for himself right about here. So Cumberland Terrace, which is this series of buildings over here, that was a very special placement on the park because it was going to be facing this palace. The palace was never built, but Cumberland Terrace was built. This is a massive structure. At the top here, you see a front elevation view of the entire structure. We have this long building and then this arch, and then a really huge long building and another arch and this long building. Down here at the bottom, you have the ground plan view of all of them. And so I just want to point out that this is a massive, long, skinny structure we're talking about. And the central area of this structure has a special something about it. Here you have an engraving from 1829 of that center area, and you can definitely see how it has that classic temple look with that series of Ionic columns and then that second level leading up to that pediment. I find it fascinating because it's just the front of a temple. In fact, that triangular pediment is actually the end of the roof structure of a classical temple. And here they're just putting the triangle up there with no roof behind it. Isn't that curious? And here is a photograph of that structure as it stands today. So you can clearly see the inspiration from the Greek temples, but also the Italian Renaissance. And when I say Italian Renaissance, I mean this balustrade level. See that level up in there with that balustrade, that railing, as well as all of these sculptures along the balustrade, as well as up on top of the pediment. Those are Renaissance adaptations of a classical style. There's something very neoclassical about this, in the sense that the decorative elements are white on a colored ground, so that blue and that ivory, those are very neoclassical. Here is a view looking down the part of the building that we haven't seen yet. This is one of the side wings. So you see we have that long series of windows with the Ionic pilasters separating them, and then these occasional protrusions that feel more like a classical Greek temple, like the Temple of Athena Nike at the Parthenon, and then another series of windows. And separating the three main buildings is a strange kind of triumphal arch. It's kind of Roman, it's kind of Greek. You see how it's taking those classical Greek columns, but then pairing them with that Roman arch in a way that the Roman triumphal arches really don't do. So this is a massive structure. This is a series of apartments. This is a massive domestic structure for the people with a ton of money, but it's borrowing exterior elements from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the Renaissance, and combining them in ways that you don't see in ancient Greece or ancient Rome or the Renaissance. Okay, I promised that I would show you some Regency buildings that have an exotic inspiration, so we're going to take a look at the Royal Pavilion. Now, the Royal Pavilion was a renovation. This is what the building originally looked like. This was designed in the late 1770s by Henry Holland. But John Nash, at the Prince Regent's request, changed it just a little bit and created this bizarre pleasure palace. Isn't this a curious structure? It doesn't look like anything that belongs in England, does it? And if you're thinking this feels more like something Walt Disney built, yeah, it kind of does. This is what we think of now as fantasy resort architecture, and it kind of became the standard for that. This building is highly irregular and very picturesque. Look at that roof line, that skyline. You see how there's all those wonderful protrusions, but they're picturesque in a way that we haven't seen in England. The Onion Dome has existed around the world for millennia by this point, but never in England. So this is borrowing forms from other cultures. And when you look closely, you see there's a Chinese influence and an Islamic influence, as well as medieval and South Asian Indian influence. It's really an eclectic structure. To point out a few oddities, the minarets, which are those tall structures here and here on corners of buildings, those are definitely from Islam. The onion domes are Islamic also. You also see this lattice work in between these columns. That is definitely a Chinese pattern. But this shape, this horseshoe shape arch, that is Islamic. So we're totally mixing and mashing styles together. And no matter how you look at this building, you're struck by the fact that it is irregular. So obviously this is an aerial view looking down at that magnificent skyline. But the construction of this is very much of the period because you're talking about cast iron covered with stucco. When we find the onion domes in the ancient world, they are made out of stone. So here we are using technology from the 17 and 1800s to create the look of something that is not authentically that style. In fact, when John Nash did this renovation, he didn't tear down the original building. He just put that weird roof line on top. So basically, from this line down is the original structure, and then from this line up, you see all of the onion domes. So they're simply superimposed on top of that original structure. And Prince George loved this building so much that he asked the architect, John Nash, to publish a book of his drawings of the pavilion, and that became a big hit in the 1820s. When we look at the interiors of the Royal Pavilion, and I'm going to show you some in a second here, you will see that they are exotic and ridiculously ostentatious and decadent and opulent, but the Chinese details tend to be the predominant details. But we're talking about lavish and exotic materials and very richly colored, gilded and hand painted wallpaper. So you're looking at all of these incredibly lush materials in a Chinese style. This is a building that screams, I've got money. From that book by John Nash, here's an interior of the banqueting room. Now, the interior was designed by Robert Jones, but you see how you have this incredibly lavish interior with these details that don't feel like they came from classical Greece or Rome or the Renaissance. They feel very exoticized. And this structure still stands to this day. In fact, you can rent out the banqueting room if you have a pile of money and you want to have your fancy party there. But look at the walls. Do you see the Chinese fretwork in these rectangular frames? You see how those feel Chinese? Even the imagery inside that frame is Chinese. Here's a view from another angle. Look up over this red curtain on the left. You have Chinese dragons and flying creatures, fantastical creatures built into the room. It's like everywhere you look, there's something exotic and fantastic. This is lavish. This is ostentatious. This is an obscene display of wealth. Taking a closer look at that end of the room, there's that same Chinese painting that I pointed out before. And I already pointed out the Chinese fretwork in that one painting, but we have that odd little pagoda shape over the doorway. But even down, look at the front of the fireplace. There's Chinese dragons that are winding their way through that cast iron work at the base of that fireplace. So wherever there's an opportunity to decorate, it's going to be decorated in a style that's been ripped off from a whole other culture. Here's another illustration from that John Nash book. This is the music room, and I wanted to show you this room because I love these lighting units and the ceiling. You see what I mean? So there you go, looking even closer at one of these lighting fixtures. And that central chandelier, I mean, how marvelous in a weird and wonderful way. And this ceiling medallion always gets me. I mean, lavish materials, everything just dripping money. Looking at the fireplace in the music room, every place you look at this, you see something marvelous and fantastical. This room has flying dragons and serpents slithering around. Oh, how wonderful and weird. Here we have an image of the saloon. Again, this is from the book by John Nash. I think you can see that each room has its own definitive design style. Here you have the room today. And those massive mirrors originally were actual silver, but that has since been replaced with platinum leaf, which doesn't tarnish in the same way that silver tarnishes. You also see specially woven panels of silk on the walls and this magnificent carpet designed and woven specifically for this room. So the decoration in this room actually is more rooted in Islam than Chinese, like some of the other rooms I've shown you. And in my research, I came across this bizarre, wonderful photograph. This is from World War II, where the Royal Pavilion was used as a hospital for soldiers from India. So there you are. This is a shot of that same saloon. Saloon is a fancy word for salon, by the way. But now here it's being used as a hospital. So even the royals got in on the act during the war. So that's the Royal Pavilion. I think you see how it's an ostentatious use of money, but it is also bizarrely eclectic in terms of borrowing stylistic features from other cultures that are considered exotic cultures at the time. So we've looked at Regency style with a classical inspiration. We've looked at Regency style with exotic inspiration, but I also wanted to show you the English Greek revival style. And this started in the late 1700s when more people from Western Europe started examining actual Greek buildings from ancient Greece and realized that they were the inspiration for the Roman styles. So all of a sudden, all of those Roman styles that everyone thought was the baseline of what is classical, everyone started to realize no, they were adapted from a previous style. So we start to have a throwback to ancient Greek looks. And this Antiquities of Athens book from 1762 was one of the things that drove this idea forward. And by 1800, there was a much stronger Greek inspiration in England. Part of this was because Lord Elgin had gone to Athens, excavated parts of the Parthenon, and he had brought them back to England. So people could literally go into the British Museum to see what the Greek styles were. In fact, you can still do that to this day. The Parthenon sculptures are still in the British Museum in London. Also, this is when Thomas Hope starts to think, I really prefer that beautiful Greek style, and he's the one who starts to push that idea forward toward the Greek revival style. And this is when we start to associate the idea of Greek style museums and libraries and art galleries and university buildings because they were aware that the Greek styles were basically temples. So this is a temple to learning, this is a temple to art. And the Greek look was starting to be used as structures for educating people about what happened in ancient times. For an example of this kind of a structure, we're going to look at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. This is a museum of art and archaeology. This is the original facade of the building, built in 1685, and this is the new facade to the building, built in the 1840s. Taking a look at the main entrance to the building, you see how it feels very Greek. And all of the decoration of this building is in honor of art and archaeology. Sitting on top of that pediment is a statue of Apollo. And of course, Apollo is the god of music and poetry and art. So that makes sense on a building that was intentionally built as an art museum. Here's another view of one of the side wings. And you see all of those classical forms. But there is something very restrained about their use here. This is considered an icon of the late neoclassical architectural style, and I think you can see why. Let's talk about interior design for a few minutes. In this period, if you had money, you wanted to show people you had money. So it very often became the thing to do to decorate the inside of your house. And each room is treated as its own unit, and it may have its own color scheme, its own theme. And so designations like the yellow room or the Chinese room or the Greek room really start to make a lot of sense. But because this is really about showing off your money, yeah, we cross the line into things becoming odd or ostentatious or just plain garish. And the innovations of the Industrial Revolution had a really big effect with interiors because textiles were cheaper and more available, because you had the technology of cast iron, so you could do balustrades and fire grates and stoves. Um, Glass manufacturing is improving, so you can have larger pieces of glass, larger windows, and more natural light. And the innovation of gaslight means that now we can have artificial lighting indoors that is not simply a burning candle wick. Books documenting interior style became highly influential. This is one by Thomas Hope. Remember, he's the designer who prefers the pure Greek forms. And this is a book that he published in 1807. It was a big hit. Let me show you some of the stuff he was designing. Here is a design from that book, The Design of a Room in the Classic Style. So take a look at it. What is he even calling a classic style? Well, if we look over here, I'm going to circle this object. Look at that. Doesn't that feel Egyptian? Look up overhead at this band of characters walking around the top of the room in this border. That is very Egyptian too. In fact, the furniture feels very Egyptian, doesn't it? So he's just simply lifting out items from the Egyptian culture and planting them in someone's living room. Here is his drawing room in the style of the Regency. And you can see how Hope is very much defining Regency as based in ancient Greece. We have these sphinxes that look familiar. We have these stools, those look familiar. Look at this table there, looks very, very familiar out of ancient Greece. Here is Hope's design for the Greek room, just in case you wanted to have massive Doric columns and massive lintels built into your living room. Okay, I guess that's an option. See what I mean about being ostentatious? And this one always makes me chuckle too. This is Hope's vase room. Just in case you have several dozen Greek vases sitting around, you can build an entire room to house them in. And here is his Aurora room. So again, based on ancient Greek ideas. Oh, I mean, seriously, could you imagine walking into someone's house for a dinner party or a cocktail party and this being the room where your party is going to be held? Wow. Let's look at some furniture of the period. Here are two library tables. The actual photograph, this one down here, was actually designed by Thomas Hope. And this other table, the drawing of the table, that's a drawing published by George Smith. So Hope wasn't the only designer who had this fascination with ancient Greece. I think the only difference between these two tables comes out in that the top one has a stretcher in there connecting the two brackets on the ends, and the actual table doesn't have a stretcher. Here we have some side tables. Both of these were designed by Thomas Hope. The top one is gilded pine with a black marble top, but those caryatids are very much reminiscent of some of the ladies up on the Acropolis in Athens. You see how Hope is basically lifting an ancient style and reusing it. He's not taking elements per se and rearranging them. He's pretty much just plain ripping off the pure form. Here we have two round occasional tables. The drawing on the left is from a Thomas Hope book, and the image on the right was a table actually designed by Hope. So these feel very much like some of the furniture that we saw in ancient Greece. Here we have some chairs that are inspired by chairs from ancient Greece, and more Greek-inspired chairs. That curved back is a big hint that this is Greek-inspired. Here are two more chairs of the period. These are not attributed to Thomas Hope, but you see how the one on the left with that back that curves around you feels very much like some of the sculptures we saw from ancient Greece. And the one on the right is clearly Egyptian inspired. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, how do I remember it's Egyptian? Remember the back legs of Egyptian furniture, when they're animal legs, they look like the back legs of that animal. This is the only culture that uses both the front and the back legs of the animal. So that trait was very carefully copied into the furniture too. And this is the last image I want to leave you with. This is a throne room. So this is a model. This is a very small room, though it looks like a real room we could walk into. Right? So this is an English rotunda and library of the Regency period. There you go. Everything we've been talking about so far. Very much Greek inspired. And yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? Thank you for your time.